Hollywood spent decades convincing the world these men were the definition of charm, sophistication, and heroism. But behind the cameras, court records, memoirs, and family testimony tell a very different story. Some of the biggest legends in film history left behind secrets the studios worked hard to keep hidden. In this countdown, you'll discover why Sean Connery defended one of his most controversial statements for over 20 years, what Bing Crosby's own family revealed after his death, how Charlie Chaplin's sealed divorce records shocked Hollywood decades later, and why the private lives of icons like Cary Grant, Peter Sellers, and Richard Burton look nothing like their carefully crafted public images. Every story in this video is based on documented interviews, court records, published memoirs, biographies, and historical reporting, not internet rumors or tabloid gossip. And make sure you stay until number 1, because the final case became one of the biggest scandals in Hollywood history, and the evidence remained hidden for nearly 90 years before resurfacing. Let's begin. Number 12, Sean Connery, the case of the unretracted statement. For millions of viewers across 3 decades, Sean Connery was the definitive James Bond. He was not simply cast as sophisticated. He embodied sophistication in a way that influenced how an entire generation understood masculinity. The elegance, the control, the implicit threat beneath the surface, these were things that seemed to come naturally to him. That image of untouchable refinement is what makes his public statements about violence against women so jarring. In a 1965 Playboy interview, a publication read by millions of men in the mid-1960s, Connery was asked directly about whether he believed in hitting women. His response was unambiguous. He did not think there was anything particularly wrong with it. More specifically, he argued that an open-handed slap could be justified in certain circumstances, provided the woman in question had been given sufficient warning. The statement was inflammatory even for 1965, when public discussion of domestic violence was nearly non-existent. For more than 2 decades, that quote remained in print. It circulated among film historians and critics. It was quoted in analyses of his career and his public persona, and Connery did not distance himself from it. Then, in 1987, Barbara Walters, one of the most prominent broadcast journalists in America, interviewed Connery on television and directly confronted him about the Playboy statement. This was not a trick question. This was a major public figure being asked to clarify or retract something he had said in print. Walters was offering him an exit, an opportunity to say he had been misquoted, or that his views had evolved, or that he regretted the statement. He refused. He told Walters that he had not changed his opinion. This is the critical moment in Connery's legacy. It was not a moment of youthful indiscretion caught on tape. It was a deliberate choice to reaffirm a position that was already indefensible by 1987 standards. He chose the position over the damage it would cause to his image. What gives the story additional weight is what emerged in Connery's personal life. His first wife, actress Diane Sento, remained largely silent about their marriage for decades. Then, in 2006, 2 years before Connery died, Sento published a memoir titled My 9 Lives, which described the marriage in terms that were impossible to misinterpret. She alleged mental and physical abuse over the course of their time together. She detailed patterns of behavior that went far beyond a single incident. Only after Sento's memoir was published, and only after the initial publicity had begun to circulate, did Connery issue a public statement saying he did not believe abuse against women was justified. The timing matters. The recantation came not from a sudden change of conscience, but from public pressure after decades of silence from the woman who had lived through what he was accused of. By then, the contradiction was permanent. GQ would later note how the quote and the rebuttal both shadowed his legacy, creating an image that could never be fully reconciled. Connery was simultaneously the suave screen legend and the man who had defended violence against women in public for years until external pressure forced a reversal. That is the pattern we are going to see repeated throughout this analysis. Number 11, Peter Sellers, the chaos beneath the character. Peter Sellers built an entire career on the idea that chaos could be charming. The character of Inspector Clouseau, bumbling, accident-prone, creating disasters through sheer incompetence, was not just funny, it was beloved. Audiences across the world watched him destroy rooms and relationships, and they laughed. The character's lack of self-awareness made the destruction feel harmless. But Britain's memoir True Brit, published years after their marriage had ended, presented a radically different picture of what chaos looks like when you are living inside it. Sellers' marriage to Britain lasted from 1964 to 1968, a relatively brief period that produced lifelong effects. According to Britain's account, the marriage was characterized by intense jealousy, constant surveillance, and sudden eruptions of unpredictable rage. Sellers was controlling in ways that went far beyond the typical relationship dynamics of that era. Britain described how quickly tenderness could evaporate and transform into humiliation. She spoke of isolation, how the marriage cut her off from her own friends and support systems, a pattern that domestic violence researchers recognize as a key mechanism of control. The emotional damage was visible in their children. Sellers' son Michael later described a childhood spent in a state of perpetual vigilance. He never knew which version of his father would enter a room. The genius that audiences found charming, the creative unpredictability, was the same unpredictability that made family life chaotic and frightening. What the public romanticized as comic eccentricity or the price of genius was, from inside the home, the atmosphere everyone else had to survive. This distinction is crucial. We live in a culture that often excuses the personal cruelty of creative men by suggesting that genius requires a certain level of chaos or instability. Sellers' story challenges that excuse. The unpredictability that entertained audiences was the same unpredictability that traumatized his family. Number 10. George C. Scott. Alcohol and intimidation. George C. Scott cultivated an image of severe, uncompromising masculinity. He seemed too formidable to care whether Hollywood approved of him. His reputation was built on discipline, seriousness, and a kind of moral force that came across even in casual interviews. He was the man who would not bend. That image is important to remember when we look at what Ava Gardner documented in her autobiography. Gardner, one of the most glamorous figures in Hollywood history, described her relationship with Scott as one of the most frightening periods of her life. The difference between their public relationship, a famous affair between two major stars, and the private reality was almost complete. According to Gardner's account, Scott's drinking was not social or recreational. It was a pathway to violence. When he drank, she wrote, he could go berserk. The language matters. This is not a description of an argument that got heated. This is a description of a transformation. And then, Gardner described a specific incident that illustrates what that transformation looked like. During one of these episodes, Scott smashed a bottle. He then held the jagged glass to Gardner's face. He struck her. The violence was calculated enough to use a weapon, but not so calculated that he avoided the risk of serious disfigurement. This is the kind of violence that exists in a particular register, beyond impulse, but not quite premeditated in the way that criminal law would understand it. It is the violence of someone who is enraged enough to hurt you, but still conscious enough to choose a method. Gardner's account includes a detail that underscores the severity. After one of these incidents, she ended up hospitalized with a broken collarbone. The injury was serious enough to require medical intervention. And when she wrote about it years later, she noted that Frank Sinatra, Gardner's close friend and occasional romantic partner, had to be talked out of confronting Scott in retaliation. What makes this story particularly significant is how it disrupts Scott's public image. His reputation was not built on charm or ease, it was built on authority, on moral weight. The man audiences watched on screen seemed incapable of the kind of loss of control that Gardner describes. That is precisely what makes her testimony so damaging to his legacy. The authority was real, the discipline was real, the violence was also real, and there is no reconciling all three. Number 9. Rex Harrison, the Hex and the Suicide. Rex Harrison carried himself with the kind of polish that seemed almost European, even though he was born in Lancashire. After My Fair Lady, he was remembered as the embodiment of wit, elegance, and upper-class control. He had a nickname among certain circles in Hollywood that told a very different story: Rex the Hex. The nickname originated from his involvement with the death of actress Carol Landis in 1948. Landis died by suicide, and while the exact circumstances have been debated by historians, contemporary accounts and later biographies consistently identified Harrison's behavior in the final period of Landis's life as a contributing factor. The accounts focus specifically on his coldness. Not anger, not cruelty in an obvious sense, but a kind of emotional abandonment, coldness towards someone who was in crisis. That coldness followed him through the industry. It never left his reputation entirely, even when his films were celebrated and his career reached its highest points. Then came Rachel Roberts, an accomplished actress who married Harrison in 1962 and divorced him in 1971. After Roberts died in 1980 following years of alcoholism and documented instability, her journals were published under the title No Bells on Sunday. The journals present a marriage corroded by contempt, by what Roberts describes as emotional cruelty, and by systematic neglect. Reading accounts of the journals, the sophistication that defined Harrison's public image begins to look less like truth and more like a carefully maintained surface. The elegance was not the man, it was camouflage. The sophisticated gentleman was not so simple at home. In many ways, the public persona and the private man were incompatible. One excluded the other. Number 8, Jerry Lewis. Charity and cruelty at home. Jerry Lewis spent decades performing compassion in public. This is not hyperbole. During the MDA Telethon, the annual fundraising broadcast that became one of the most watched television events in America, Lewis would cry. Not strategically. The tears seemed genuine. He would plead with viewers to donate. He would position himself as almost saintly, a man moved to tears by suffering, capable of marshalling his celebrity to alleviate it. That image was powerful. It shaped how millions of Americans understood Jerry Lewis. He was the man who cared. What his household produced was testimony that contradicted that image almost completely. When his marriage to Patty Palmer collapsed in 1980, the public saw scandal. What emerged later, through family accounts and interviews given over the course of decades, was a picture of a home shaped by fear, by rigid domination, and by punishment. His son Gary Lewis spoke publicly and repeatedly about his father, and his language was unambiguous. He called him mean. He called him evil. He said his father had shown his children no real love or care. Gary Lewis's willingness to speak publicly about his own father, to use language that harsh, that direct, suggests a depth of damage that casual observers might not fully grasp. You do not call your father evil lightly, especially not when he is still alive and powerful. A later investigation by Vanity Fair gathered additional testimony from women who described humiliation, harassment, and the abuse of power around Lewis. None of these allegations erases his genuine charitable work or his talent as a performer. What they do is force the televised tears into a different light. The man praised as a patron saint to suffering children left behind a family history that reads nothing like mercy. The split between the public performance of compassion and the private reality of the household is almost impossible to miss. Number 7, Richard Burton. When Myth Launders Harm. Richard Burton's voice could make almost anything sound noble. That is not an exaggeration. His vocal timbre, his accent, his deliberate pacing, these elements combined to lend gravity to even mundane dialogue. When he spoke about his marriage to Elizabeth Taylor, the press and the culture absorbed his framing. The relationship became a narrative of tempestuous passion, volcanic love, furious romance. The language made the relationship sound grand, operatic, almost mythological. The testimony of people who actually witnessed the relationship described something much uglier. Letters, diaries, and the memories of friends documented alcohol-fueled fights that destroyed rooms, jealousy that went beyond possessiveness into paranoia, a relationship that was repeatedly pushed toward both physical and emotional chaos. Vanity Fair's reassessment of the Burton-Taylor marriage notes a crucial progression. What began as theatrical combat, the kind of dramatic argument that can seem almost entertaining from a distance, grew more brutal over time as drinking intensified. Burton was not hiding his alcoholism. The drinking was practically woven into the mythology. It was part of the story. The man who drank dangerously and loved theatrically. The narrative was romantic. But myth has a remarkable capacity to launder reality. Diamonds, yachts, and famous love letters made the relationship look grand from a distance. It looked like excess, like the kind of extravagant romance that only the very wealthy and very famous could afford. Up close, in the testimonies and biographies, the same relationship looks like a marriage in which drinking did not simply accompany conflict. It fed it. It enlarged it. It helped repackage harm as romance. Hollywood preferred the poetry of excess to the plain language of harm. It still does. Number 6, Desi Arnaz, the perfect husband who was not perfect. Desi Arnaz became one of television's first great husband figures. In I Love Lucy, he was funny, charming, loyal, the man perpetually trying to get back into Lucy Ricardo's good graces after some domestic mishap. He was aspirational. For millions of American households, he was the template for what a husband should be. The marriage behind the show was strained for years by heavy drinking, by serial infidelity that was known to people close to them but kept away from the public, and by explosive behavior that continued to be documented decades later by biographers and family members. Lucille Ball had attempted to leave him on previous occasions. When she finally filed for divorce in 1960, the legal grounds were widely reported as mental cruelty. Even in recent decades, when people revisit the history of their relationship, the focus remains on Arnaz's alcoholism and chronic infidelity as the primary causes of the breakup. But what is fascinating, and what tells us something about how celebrity operates, is how long his image remained protected. The protection was not simply a matter of personal charisma or strategic publicity. It was business. Ball and Arnaz were not merely stars, they were co-owners of Desilu Productions, one of the most powerful television companies in America at that time. They produced the shows that other networks aired, they employed hundreds of people. Too many livelihoods depended on the public believing in the dream of the perfect couple. That made the private damage easier to soften, to euphemize, and to sell as one more sad love story instead of what Ball was escaping. The infrastructure of Hollywood made it possible to protect the image, no matter what the reality looked like. Number 5, Errol Flynn. Recklessness made beautiful. Errol Flynn helped invent the swashbuckling ideal. On screen, he moved through dangers laughing, rescued women with theatrical gestures, and presented recklessness as a form of beauty. The image was intoxicating. Young men wanted to be him, young women wanted to be with him. And the studios knew exactly what they had. His real life was reckless too, but far less romantic. By 1935, he had married actress Lily Demeter, and accounts of that marriage, including Flynn's own memoir and later biographical work, present a union defined by volatility, infidelity, and heavy drinking. Contemporary sources noted how Demeter was described as tempestuous. The relationship was part of the chaotic storm surrounding his rise. But here is where studio logic becomes clear. Warner Brothers had every reason to keep that storm marketable. Flynn was one of the studio's greatest box office assets. Scandal management was literally part of the machinery. The public needed to see him as reckless and dangerous, but in a charming way, the kind of danger that made you want to buy a ticket. That is how a phrase like Flynn drifted into popular culture almost as a joke, almost as a wink at excess. Instead of serving as a warning about the household instability that follows a man whose appetites are constantly being transformed into charm by the people around him, it became a compliment. The heroism was real on screen, the danger was real at home. Number 4, Bing Crosby. The father who beat his sons. Bing Crosby's image was almost impossible to compete with. He sang White Christmas. He embodied ease. He collected fatherly honors and honors for charity work, while his voice seemed to emanate comfort itself. The image was so strong that it felt like truth. In 1983, his eldest son, Cary Crosby, published a memoir titled Going My Own Way, and in it, he described a childhood of beatings, humiliation, and pervasive dread. The most frequently cited detail was the belt studded with metal that Cary claimed his father used to strike him and his brothers, a belt that, according to Cary's account, left him bleeding on multiple occasions. A Washington Post review of the memoir repeated those allegations. Later family coverage noted that Cary's brother Lindsay broadly supported Cary's version of events, while another brother, Philip, rejected it. But what no one disputes is that the family was deeply damaged. Dennis Crosby and Lindsay Crosby both later died by suicide. Even before Cary's memoir, an old-time profile of Bing had already described his punishing discipline and his documented frustration that fear was not producing obedience. What makes the public honors feel eerie in retrospect is the timing. While the culture celebrated him as the warmest father in America, the children inside his house were learning that affection could evaporate the moment discipline began. The public image survived Crosby's death with almost no damage. The innocence of the image did not. Number 3. Oliver Reed. When chaos becomes content. Oliver Reed was marketed less as a respectable gentleman than as a lovable catastrophe. By the 1970s, British television had transformed his drunken volatility into a kind of national sideshow. Producers and broadcasters knew that if Reed appeared on a live broadcast, something might explode. That risk itself became entertainment. He was the guest who might do anything. Biographies of Reed, including Evil Spirits, frame his drinking as more than colorful excess. It was the engine of intimidation, of broken relationships, and of household chaos. His first wife, Kate Byrne, and subsequent partners lived with a man whose public loss of control was being sold back to audiences as rogue charisma. The danger was practically the point. Reed's legend made accountability almost impossible because he was never pretending to be safe. The danger was part of the brand from the beginning. Once the chaos becomes content, once the instability is monetized and cheered by audiences, the victims disappear from the frame. They become invisible background to the entertainment. Number 2. Cary Grant. Elegance as disguise. Cary Grant may have been the most polished male star classical Hollywood ever produced. He did not simply play sophistication. He seemed to define it. His elegance was not a performance that audiences could see through. It was something that seemed intrinsic to him, something he was rather than something he did. The testimony around his marriage to Diane Cannon has complicated that image consistently. Cannon's memoir and later interviews describe a husband who could be deeply jealous, controlling, and psychologically overwhelming. The emotional architecture of their marriage was shaped by his need for dominance. Vanity Fair's recent reassessment of Grant's life notes that Cannon became one of the clearest witnesses to the gap between public fantasy and private reality. The documentary Becoming Cary Grant also revived attention to his extensive involvement with LSD therapy in the late 1950s and 1960s, a practice he embraced as a route to self-discovery. That history is relevant because Cannon described being drawn into those therapeutic experiences and pressures as part of the marriage itself. Instead of healing, she found them destabilizing. The therapy that Grant was pursuing for his own benefit was being imposed on her as part of the marriage dynamic. This is less about a single tabloid incident and more about a pattern of coercion, emotional strain, and control described by the woman who lived it. The perfect gentleman was not so simple at home. Elegance did not cancel domination. It disguised it. Number 1. Charlie Chaplin. The Sealed Archive. Charlie Chaplin built one of the most beloved figures in cinema history out of vulnerability, innocence, and wounded dignity. The tramp character, defined by poverty and mistreatment, seemed to embody human suffering in a way that was almost transcendent. That makes the record left by his second wife, Lita Grey, especially shocking. Grey was 16 years old when she married the 35-year-old Chaplin in 1924 after becoming pregnant. In 1927, just 3 years later, she filed a lengthy divorce complaint. The allegations were striking even by the standards of that era. She claimed cruel and inhuman treatment. More specifically, according to summaries preserved in the Chaplin archive, she alleged that Chaplin had pressed her to undergo an illegal operation to prevent the birth of their first child. In 1927, an illegal operation meant an abortion obtained outside any medical oversight, a dangerous procedure that could have killed her. The case became a national scandal. Chaplin's estate, valued at $16 million, was frozen by the court. The settlement ultimately reached was $825,000, then reported as a record amount in a divorce case. The publicity was severe enough that it damaged his standing, but not permanently. The image recovered. What gives the story an afterlife now is the paper trail. Accounts published in the 2010s reported that the original divorce documents had resurfaced after being discovered in an abandoned bank vault nearly 90 years later. The detail is almost too perfect. The sealed legal language of old Hollywood opened back up, and inside it a version of Chaplin's life that the little tramp could never soften. The rediscovered filing did not create the scandal. It merely made it tangible again. It proved that the record existed. It had always existed. It had just been locked away, the pattern. These are not 12 isolated scandals. They are one recurring arrangement: fame on the outside, fear on the inside, and families forced to live in the shadow of a legend. The studio system did not simply create images. It created a culture in which images mattered more than reality. It created economic incentives to keep the image intact, regardless of what was happening in private. And it created a framework in which women and children inside those households had very little recourse. Who were they going to tell? Who would believe them over the legend? What changed was not the behavior. What changed was the infrastructure. The memoir became possible. The interview became possible. The documentary became possible. And the internet made it possible for all of these documents to exist in the same space, creating a friction that the old image management system could not absorb. The legends survived because the images survived. But the images are not surviving anymore. What endures now is the contradiction. And that contradiction is far more damaging to memory than any scandal ever was. If you found this deep dive into the actual history of Hollywood's most celebrated figures compelling, if the gap between public persona and private reality fascinates you, then subscribe to this channel. We dive regularly into the stories that the entertainment industry prefers to keep buried and the evidence that keeps resurfacing no matter how much time passes. Which of these figures' legacies do you think has been most damaged by the resurfacing of these accounts? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one,